Welcome to Just Minding My Business. We are glad you stopped by. I'm your host, Ida Crawford. Need more visibility on your products or services? Visit us at jmmbmediallc.com to learn more. Culturally intelligent innovation begins with changing our impulse from why can't you see it like I do to help me see what I might be missing.
Mhm.
David Livermore. I am so happy to bring to you today Stephan M. Branch, who is the author of Cultural Intelligence in the 21st Century, Driving Inclusion, Revenue, and ESG. As the founder and CEO of World Trade Resource, he has led privately held and multi-billion dollar publicly traded companies in the US, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. During his tenure at those companies, he was responsible for a total of 55 countries and lived on 5 continents. Welcome, Stephen, to Just Minding My Business. We're so happy that you joined us today and can't wait to dig in.
Thank you, Ida. Thank you for the warm welcome. I'm excited
Abs-
to be here.
Absolutely. So, for our audience, define cultural intelligence.
So, cultural intelligence is, we think about EQ, emotional intelligence, and IQ, right? And then
Mhm.
CQ, cultural quotient, is all about the ability of a person to communicate across cultures, countries, and ethnicities. I think people assume that we all sort of think the same, view the world the same, have the same lens, but we don't. They're all very different depending on where we grew up, how we grew up, and honestly, not even just country to country, but if you grew up in the Bronx or in Harlem, that's different, where I live, as opposed to Laguna Niguel in California. So we all grow up with very different lens that we see the world through.
Mhm.
um, and people, I don't think, really understand that. You get to a certain level in business and people get it. They get the importance of cultural intelligence and how it affects the way they build their brand, their strategy, the way they negotiate, whether it's a merger, acquisition, or a supply chain agreement, or the way they communicate with their audience, as we're doing today. It's different depending on where you come from and the culture from which you come.
Absolutely. And being in the IT field, I've
Mhm.
worked with people in all different countries, nationalities, uh, i- and I'm definitely feeling what you're saying because people, depending on where they live, they have different beliefs.
Mhm.
They approach things differently.
Entirely. Question I have for you, Ida, is given that you work in the IT space, have you interacted with India very much at all?
Yes, I have all the
Okay.
time. I think
So,
we all
you
have.
know, India is one of those places where consistently I think that US corporations, not just US, but European companies too, find challenges. It's probably one of the most challenging places to do business because, first of all, yes doesn't mean yes. It just means I heard you. And
Hmm.
so I can't tell you how many times US executives have said to me, I find it very frustrating working with Indians. And when I ask them why, they say, well, because they seem to change their mind very quickly. And what I have to help people understand is if I say yes and I'm Indian, that doesn't mean anything other than I heard you. It doesn't mean I agree with you. It doesn't mean that I'm going to accept your conditions of a contract or anything else. So people are taught differently, right? Our educational systems teach different things, different values, different traits, different characteristics. So um, it sounds like you've experienced that. If you're working in tech and you've been interacting with people in India, then you probably get that.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And sometimes, like you said, it can be frustrating uh, because the understanding is totally different than United States and the United States as a whole.
Mhm.
So it can be very difficult. And a lot of times I find that when I'm talking to somebody in the Indian space, I feel like they are really not listening to me because the answer that I get when I get answer a question is not connected to what I asked,
Mhm.
so to speak.
I understand. I hear you. And a lot of that is in terms of the way we communicate, because we as US Americans, we're taught to be very direct communicators, very explicit, very to the point, especially if you're in New York where I am. It's very much give me the directness, tell me what I need to know, and only the minimum, and that's it. In places like India and all of Latin America and much of Asia and much of Europe, people are taught the opposite. They're taught to be indirect. And a lot of times, US Americans and Germans will say, well, that's such a waste of time. The difference is those cultures and those countries are very focused on the relationship. So if I have something to deliver in a message to Ida, my number one concern is going to be our relationship. So I'm very careful about the way it's going to land on Ida. And so for that reason, I'm going to be more implicit. I'm going to give her cues and clues that she can read between the lines, especially if it's anything critical. Um, we've worked with some of the largest manufacturing companies in the world and have saved them hundreds of millions of dollars on negotiating supply chain agreements because Indians negotiate differently than U.S. Americans. The Chinese will tell you they love to negotiate with U.S. Americans because they don't have to work. And when you ask them what they mean by that, they exercise the power of silence. We as
Mhm.
US Americans hate silence. Silence means you're wasting my time, you're disrespecting my time, or you don't agree with what I'm saying. There's something off. And the Chinese use that as a time of reflection and thought, and it's not uncomfortable for them. And so, literally, when I've negotiated acquisitions between the US and China, I've had the Chinese just sit there and let the US Americans negotiate with themselves. And so it's when people think of it as a soft skill, it's not a soft skill. It's a hard skill. It affects everything we do in our business, from the way we build our brand, our sales, our marketing, the way we run our operations, our supply chain. And even if you're a small company and you're looking at expanding into another country, or maybe you're in the US and you're not looking at, or Canada, and you're not looking at expanding into another country, but you need to know how to better communicate with your consumers. And I say a lot of times to people, look at the demographic of your consumers ethnically, right? Not just where they're from, but ethnically. Are they African American? Are they Puerto Rican? Are they Chinese American? Are they Italian American? Zero in on that piece, because that's the part that's going to help you communicate more effectively and drive business results and performance by understanding your market. But a lot of people don't know that. It's a lot of people are new to that space.
Yes. So when you say understand the culture, so to speak,
Mhm.
how do you do that?
So there are basically 9 different competencies that we learn that, and a lot of people will say to me, especially US Americans, they will say, oh, it seems like you're trying to change who I am. No, this is a business competency that you can learn and you can apply into any and every aspect of your business. It doesn't matter if I'm working in the Bronx or I'm working in Los Angeles. I can come into a room and knowing who the people are in the room, I can flex my cultural competency and intelligence based on the room. And so some of us are very high relationships, some are very low. And people say, well, it doesn't matter, does it, at the end of the day? I mean, does it? It does. Because high relationship people, we build trust, credibility, and respect through the relationship. So if I want to, and I'm very high relationship, which is very atypical of US Americans. Most US Americans are very low relationship, like the Germans. But because of all the years, I grew up in a small town in the South. The first part of my career, I was in Latin America, then I was in Asia, then I was in Spain and France, lots of countries that were very high relationship.
Mhm.
And so for me, the relationship is what's important. So I understand that's how I build trust, credibility, and respect with Ida, is developing a relationship with her outside the business meeting. US Americans, for the most part, don't see the value in that. They will say to you, we really don't need to spend time getting to know Ida. It doesn't matter. It's not important to the business. But 190 of the 200 countries on the planet would disagree with you. And that's what most US Americans don't get. We're an anomaly. We're not the norm. And so there are about 10 countries, Scandinavia, Australia, Germany, the US, where we're not concerned about the relationship. But the rest of the world, they are concerned. So the global best practice is for a business leader or entrepreneur to be high relationship.
Yes, and I have to agree with you because to me, you need to get to know people,
Mhm.
and relationships matter to me as well. I'm always have been since a kid. Relationships matter because that's like you said, the trust, things like that. And, as you build a relationship, you get to know people, you get to know what affects them, you get to know how to speak to them, you know, if it's a critical situation that you need to say something not so pleasing, you know
Critical.
how to do that
Hmm.
because you've taken the time to actually build a relationship with the person.
That's true. I'll give you a quick example. We have a probably the third or fourth largest company in the world as a client, and I was working with the head of talent acquisition, and he was recruiting. And you'll appreciate this because of your background in tech and your clients. He was recruiting a new CIO, and normally he would have one of his 200 people do that for him. And he's based in New York. The corporate headquarters is on the West Coast. You can figure out who it is.
Mhm.
It's someone we all use every day, right?
Right.
The common household name. And he negotiated the recruitment of the CIO himself because it was so high profile. And he was a naysayer of the work of cultural intelligence until he had this experience. And that's when I sat down with him. And he said to me, I spent 6 months negotiating this deal with a new CIO. And at the end, I said to him, I want to find out how this experience was for you. And he said, I fully expected him to say it was fantastic. But when I asked him, he looked at me and he said it was horrible. And I said, why? Why? Was it the stocks, the shares, the comp, the benefits? He said, no, it was none of that. It was you. It was all you.
Mm.
And in that moment, he said, he looked at him and said, what did I do? He said, it's not what you did. It's what you didn't do. He said, for 6 months, we've been talking. Never once did you show any interest in me as a human being. You never tried to build a relationship. You never cared about my wife, my kids, about anything in my world. And he said, the thing is, I wasn't sure if I wanted to work for a company like that. And Ida, here's the worst part, because he already signed the agreement. He said, I'm still not sure.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so when people say it doesn't affect the bottom line, it's huge, huge impact.
I think so. I've
Um,
always thought so. I can't imagine, I do business with people I like.
yeah, right. And that's a privilege. It's a blessing and a privilege. And I agree with you. When people ask me, what's the benefit of running your own organization? Because I've worked for multi-billion-dollar publicly traded companies all over the world. And when people say, what's the biggest benefit of working for yourself? That's it right there. I get to work with people I like and people I respect and
Mhm.
people that I enjoy. And we have shared common values. And that's a high relationship person. Um, so yeah, that's I couldn't agree with you more as an entrepreneur.
Yes, and I mean, it just makes sense. Uh, It's uncomfortable if you're dealing with somebody and they are, I call them stuffed shirts,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
and you just don't feel anything. You
Hmm.
just, and it's a turnoff.
Yep.
It's a huge turnoff. Now, your book, what can people walk away with after reading your book?
So probably one of three things, depending on who they are and where they come from. The book is Cultural Intelligence in the 21st Century, Driving Inclusion, Revenue, and ESG. And so for those of us who care about inclusion, they're going to walk away with something that they probably haven't seen or heard before. One of the things that I've been big on my whole life. Growing up, my brother passed when I was 5. My father when I was 12. I had a mentally challenged sister. I had a very strong mother influence. I grew up in a multiracial, very diverse family and community. And for me, inclusion was something really important, right? Because I got to experience firsthand every day how my sister wasn't included because she was mentally challenged and how she was ostracized. And so as my earliest memories, I can remember what that felt like. So for me, I've always been aware and hypervigilant of what does inclusion mean, right? And to me, it means the person and the people feeling seen, heard, and respected. It comes
Mhm.
down to those three things. If a person feels seen, heard, and respected, and one of the issues that I've seen with U.S. companies is they don't seem to understand what that really means, right? They think putting laws and regulations in place will help, and yes, it does help. But when you're talking about a global organization and you don't know what that looks like in a different ethnicity, whether you're Puerto Rican, whether you're Nigerian, whether you're Brazilian, if you don't know what that looks like, respect and integrity and trust, as you said, we're high relationships. So you and I build trust and credibility and respect through relationships. If you miss that piece, you're not creating an inclusive workforce. You're not. And so, one of the things that we see a lot in organizations is how do you create cultures of belonging and inclusion globally with all ethnicities and all people of color, all religions, right? It's something that we've not done so well at in this country.
Mhm.
If I'm being frank, part of the reason I wrote this book was because I think there's a way for me to have a conversation with the C suite that can get them to open their eyes and see what we're talking about here. We're talking about building business inclusive cultures, full stop. That's it.
Mhm.
And so for those people, creating cultures of belonging and inclusion, that's a huge takeaway. And that's, having a family who's multiracial and multicultural. That's for me personally my hope. That's the takeaway. Get 50% of the population that's not open to that conversation to start having that conversation and to look at it in a way that perhaps they can understand. The second part is driving revenue. So, revenue is all about how do we sell differently, just like you and I talked about. How do we market and brand differently with different ethnicities and different cultures? Look, I was shocked to learn 3, 4 years ago that Calvin Klein, some of their biggest consumer buyers in the African American community and the Latino community, but they had no targeted branding or marketing that even was in Spanish or any other language. They didn't recognize their consumer market, right?
Mhm.
So whether it's brand sales, marketing, whatever, driving revenue, and we know exponentially that if people understand cultural intelligence, they can just increase their revenue exponentially. It's huge. The third part is ESG, and it's become very politicized. People are talking a lot about it right now, and you've got left wing, right wing, everybody vying for their opinion and saying, ESG is not important. Here's what I would say: E is for environment, S is for society, and G is for governance. So when people hear the term ESG, the E and the G, right? Those are the two that are pretty easy to measure. We can measure our environmental practices, we can measure our governance, but it's that middle piece, it's the S. What
Mhm.
are we really doing to drive changes as an organization in society for more social equity? And how does that look? Organizations have missed one of the pieces that's really important. You can tie the S back in ESG to what you're doing globally. So whether you're working in the Bronx or you're in Harlem or you're in Berlin, it doesn't matter. There are measurable diagnostics, and I saw on your website before I came on to interview with you, doing my own research, you're big into the tech space. So one of the things that we believe is taking a digital solution that you can socialize across an organization that will measure people's knowledge of social equity, differences in race and ethnicity and gender and so on, and tie that back to their ESG rating. And I'll end by saying people will always ask me, who cares? People care because the ESG rating that companies get today, there's a direct correlation to share price, valuation of the company, and their employee retention. And so you and I are about the same generation. But if you're talking about the alpha and the Z generation and the millennial generation, those are the investors of today and tomorrow. They want to invest in organizations who have shared philosophies and common values of doing good for the world.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't really matter at the end of the day if people in the baby boomer XY generation say, we don't want to talk about ESG anymore. It's not going to go away. because there's a direct correlation between the valuation of a company and their share price and their ESG rating. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks, it's there. And so one of the best ways to increase the S is through your social equity policies and looking at how you treat your employees globally. Are you creating a culture of belonging and inclusion where people feel seen, heard, and respected? And those are rated and they can be measured. And so there are three different areas, I think, of the book. If you're a hardcore capitalist and you're only interested in revenue, great. But if you're a humanitarian and you care about inclusion, you're going to get that. And there are probably 6 or 7 different people who have written chapters in the book, which really share raw stories. I mean, really raw stories. I was so impressed by how people were unveil themselves in high-level corporate position, mostly women of color, some men of color. And the stories they share in the book are just, to me, they're motivational. They're a little bit heartbreaking, but they're motivational, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, 3 things between the two: revenue, inclusion, and ESG.
Wow. How do people get the book?
You can go to Amazon.com and just type in cultural intelligence in the 21st century. You can go to Target, and you can also go to Barnes and Noble as well. I was trying to think if there was another one. I think those are the main 3. The main one is Amazon. It's probably the easiest to get, and you can get an ebook, you can get an audiobook, you can get a hardback. Simon & Schuster is distributing it all over Europe, Asia, and the US in multiple languages. And so, yeah, I'm excited.
I'm excited. You should be, because this is so important. I mean, I worked in corporate America for many, many years. And I never always felt like I belonged at the table. I felt at times that my experience, my expertise didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a horrible feeling.
Yeah.
It really is a horrible feeling. And what I believe companies need to understand, especially in terms of retaining good health, people talk.
Yes.
Your employees
Yes.
are your biggest marketers. Because
You're
if
right.
they enjoy where they work, they're going to tell somebody. I
You're
love
right.
it here.
You're right. And it's interesting you say that, because one of the women, very strong, young Puerto Rican, who wrote a chapter for the book, and she said to me early on, I had a mentor that was a white Caucasian woman who sat me down and sort of mentored me and said, here's the playbook, here's the unspoken playbook about navigating your way through the corporate America. And she said it wasn't long before I realized her playbook couldn't be my playbook.
Right.
Because I was a woman of color and who spoke, she said it wasn't a situation where I could take her playbook and make it work for me. So I had to create my own. And so I think a lot of what we talk about in the book, just like with that chapter, it's about inspiration for young, strong women and women of color, and advice on what they can do to change the dynamic, change the spectrum, change the playing field, because there is a way to do it. And honestly, at cultural intelligence, people have asked me, because I've run lots of different companies, lived on 5 continents. I've been always able to go in and show quick results. And the only secret to that, I'm not any different than any other person. Doesn't matter. Where I'm different is I've always understood that cultural differences have a huge impact on the way we develop relationships, to your point, contracts, businesses, the way we build brand, strategy, everything we do, and leveraging those relationships and partnerships to create better performance in an organization. And if you can do that and create an inclusive culture where people do feel seen, heard, and respected, why wouldn't you, right? Why wouldn't you do that?
Exactly. But what I find is sometimes companies, they realize this, but they don't do the work.
You're right. And you know why? They haven't been taught or told, and hasn't been proved to them, the economic impact on the bottom line. So there's so many conversations in the United States that have been going on for years, right, about how diversity creates more employee retention and profitability. And that's great. But if I can walk into a boardroom or a C-suite and I can sit down with executives and I can say to them, look, there's a reason that your numbers are not up in Brazil or Mexico or Nigeria or Ghana. There's a reason. There's a reason you can't achieve the business results that you want to achieve. And it's because you're trying to run those businesses as you would one in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
You're taking a very US centric approach and you're not recognizing the differences in ethnicity. My soapbox on the side is I do a lot of pro bono work, and I've developed different solutions, digital, which you'll appreciate from a tech standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third, fourth, up through eighth, and then university as well. And we're building one right now for high school. My belief is if you can start to and begin to teach kids about these differences in ethnicity, which is what it all comes down to,
Mm-hmm.
at the very beginning, you're going to cut down so much racism and biases and prejudice and bigotry that goes on and on and on and just perpetuates itself. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, my son is half Asian. He's Filipino. I have another son that's half Brazilian. I remember the half Filipino son coming home to me in second or third grade saying to me, kids are asking me why I don't look like the rest of the Chinese and why I look weird. And I said, because you're not Chinese. And he said, but they've never seen a person like me. And he's Filipino, so he has round eyes.
Mm-hmm.
It just the bias, right? The bias that people they don't recognize. I work a lot with obviously C-suite Caucasians, and they will have these conversations with me about not really understanding the differences. And I say to them, let me ask you a question. You're white, right? Yeah. Okay. So is that German guy. So is that Irish guy, right? So is that Mexican guy. So is that guy in South Africa. They're all white, but they're totally different people. They got different belief systems, different ethnicities, different religions, different way of thinking about life and the world. So why do you think that everyone's black is like this and everyone who's brown is like this? And Ida, I will tell you, it's embarrassing to admit, they will say to me, wow, never thought about it like that. And that's scary. That's scary to me,
Very scary.
right? But
Mm-hmm.
until you put it in that perspective and people can start thinking about ethnicity, we're not talking about color, talking about ethnicity. What
Mm-hmm.
is different, right? I mean, in the Bronx and in Harlem where I live, the Dominicans are very different than the Mexicans, right? Or the Nigerians or the Algerians. Everyone's different depending on where they come from and
Mm-hmm.
how they grew up. It really does come back to the cultural differences in ethnicity at the end of the day, in
Yes,
my opinion.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And the way that I look at it, you know, it's like flowers. Every flower has is different.
Yeah.
And suppose we were all the same.
Mhm.
Boredom, boredom, boredom.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. That's what I say. Thank you for saying that, because people will say to me when I moved to Harlem and to Hamilton Heights, I actually had a chief diversity officer at a company that asked me, why would you choose to live here? I said, why? Because it's a dynamic, vibrant community, and there are like 6, 10 different ethnicities living in this community, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
Why would I not? And you could tell there was this assumption that, well, you would live on the Upper West Side, East Side, or here or there. Why would you choose to live here? And I said to her, I said, because first of all, that's where I'm comfortable. I don't I don't work well living in a community where everyone looks the same, first of all. I said, second of all, I have a son who it's important to me that he grow up in a diverse community.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what she said to me? She said to me, and she's a New Yorker. She said to me, so you're creating a false idea of what reality is like.
Wow.
And I said, wow, how did you get there? How did you get there? That's a huge leap. I said, not my reality. My reality is where people from all different cultures and ethnicities and ages and colors and races are around each other daily, working, interacting with each other, and
Yes.
contributing to society. So how could you say that's a false idea of what the real world is like? But it's her lens, her
Mhm.
perspective, right?
Yes. And
Yeah,
it's horrible, and it's a lot of that lens in the world. So the
yeah.
work that you do is so critical right now. And David, I mean not David, Stephen. I'm reading David Livermore on my screen, but Stephen, it's like this.
My book is better than David's, I promise. I
Okay,
promise you. So we're gonna get you a full copy because my book is better than David's.
I believe you. I mean, you're so down to earth. You understand different, and it's okay.
Yeah,
And why do people think that it's not okay? Because when we're born, we don't know what we are.
that's right.
Nobody does.
Yeah.
We
I think US culture, and this is not going to be a popular thing to say, but I believe it's true, and I've seen the research. We we promote the idea of sameness, right? So what's the latest haircut? What's the latest style? What's this? What's
Mhm.
that? We want to assimilate, we want to blend, and if you stand out, well, that's not good. You're not a good citizen. And that's where it comes down to, because ethnicity isn't about everybody being homogenized and blending where there's no texture and complexity and interest and
Mhm.
curiosity and empathy and global mindedness and appreciation for different music. That's not what that is, right? A friend of mine who works out in Seattle, she is Latina, and she said, she works for a very high profile individual, and she said, I think I want to move to New York. And I asked her why. And she said, well, I feel like, whatever. And I said, I don't buy that. I said, let me ask you this. I said, is it because Seattle is so white, so homogenous, so vanilla, the food, the music, the people? And she died out laughing. And she said, that's exactly what it is. She said, I need to be around a community where there's diversity of thought and people and race and ethnicity and religion and food and all those things, right? And but she wasn't willing, even though we're friends, she wasn't willing to say that to me. And so I said it to her, and she laughed and she said, you're right. I mean, we're all different, right? We want different things, and that's okay. um but at the end of the day, it's whether it's an organization that really cares behind closed doors or not, they have to care. Creating cultures of belonging and inclusion, it's not going to go away. And so you're right. You said employee retention, employee recruitment. But the
Mhm.
other piece is on the revenue side. It's a direct hit on ESG. And so an organization today that says they don't care about ESG, they're lying, because that's share price and valuation, period. And if they don't care about diversity or inclusion or doing business in other cultures and respecting that, fine. But they have to care about their ESG rating. And
Mhm.
that's where I'm trying to have an impact, because I don't think we've been able to impact corporate America the way we want historically to this time. And I think that's another way of impacting it, is really looking at what does it look like globally and ethnically. So we'll see. I hugely appreciate you having me on. I mean, this has
Oh,
been one of the
absolutely.
best interviews I've had, to be honest with you.
Thank you so much. I'm just flowing right now with all of the conversation, and you mentioned earlier about people in the revenue not being great in places like Nigeria or whatever because of the difference. I had an experience because at one time I used to have to shop at Lane Bryant.
Mhm.
So I would get the catalog and it would be all these skinny girls in there. And I'm like, come on now, I'm a curvy girl.
Yeah.
how, how are these clothes gonna look on me? And I actually wrote them. And I told them that I felt like if you're going to be marketing to the 14 and over
Mhm.
size, then you need to have women in that category. And they
Exactly.
obviously took that to heart and they actually made that change.
You should have sent them a bill. an invoice, right? Because that's the thing, right? It's that kind of feedback that I think when we look at organizations and they think about their strategy and their brand and their marketing and their sales, and they don't understand how they're not as successful in other cultures and countries as their own, whether they be US or German or UK or whatever. Um, it's exactly that. I could give you countless examples of how I've seen businesses, Fortune 100 and 500 companies that have failed in other cultures and countries because they didn't understand the culture. They
Mm,
didn't understand the buying behavior. And when people say, well, I don't do business internationally, I say, yeah, you do. If you go to an office or if you have your own business, you're interacting with everyone from Puerto Ricans to Chinese to Nigerians to Dominicans. It doesn't matter where you are in the United States.
mhm,
Even if you're not doing business in other cultures and countries, you are in this country. And so you should care. I mean, my son just went through the college admissions process, and I was really pleased to see probably the first generation where universities are now saying, we want to understand your CQ.
mm,
Why do they care? Well, they care because you're talking about a global economy where people are expected to show up at work and know how to coexist well
yes.
and be cohesive with people from all races, ethnicities, colors, cultures. They're expected to do that. And there's been this thing for the last 5 years where corporates have been saying, universities, you need to prepare your students better because we're getting students from some of the best schools in the country that don't have a clue. And they don't know how to work on global teams that are diverse and multi-ethnic.
Mm,
And then you get universities saying, but we don't have the money. So a lot of the work I'm doing is also pro bono within the academic community,
mm,
where I'm helping them understand, you know, there's a way to go about this, right? And it's not just a single conversation. There are competencies. There are 9. It's nothing huge that you can learn, and you can apply those
mhm.
to any business context. You can apply them to yours, especially given the tech products and the industry that you work in. Um, so yeah, it's not insurmountable. It's non-competencies. You can apply them anywhere once you learn them. It's no different than selling, negotiating, presenting.
Absolutely. Wow, Stephen, this has been eye-opening. We're definitely going to have to do this again
I
because
hope so.
it is very important that people hear this a lot
I
because I think as a people in the United States are slipping when it comes to that.
Yeah, huge,
I
huge.
see it all the time. I feel it in
Yeah.
certain environments. So I know you're not wrong.
What I think would be great is if you have some of the high level profile women of color and really interesting people who have written chapters for the book to come on your show and talk about
Yes.
it. Because one particular person, Puerto Rican in the Bronx, who really comes to mind, uh, she wrote a chapter that's really moving. I mean, it's really, really moving. And she was the one that said, I realized my playbook couldn't look like her playbook. I had to come up with my own playbook. And as a woman of color. And so that might be interesting for you to look at, going forward. But I
Yes.
really appreciate the time. And you're so easy to talk to. Um,
Thank you.
so I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Is there
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're definitely going to do this again. And I'm looking forward to talking with the people in the book because
let's do it.
this is important. So we will definitely stay connected to make that happen.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Have a good day.
You
Bye.
too.